NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg meeting with President Biden just moments ago ahead of the military alliance's 75th anniversary conference in Washington next month. Our Washington correspondent Louise Martinez joins us live now from the White House with more. Good evening, Louise. What can you tell us about today's meeting, and what were some of the most salient topics that the president and the NATO chief likely were discussing?
Of course, Steve, as you mentioned, this Monday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg met with President Joe Biden at the Oval Office ahead of NATO's annual summit that will take place here in D.C. in July. This year's annual summit will also be the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the founding of NATO. Now, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg earlier today also spoke at the Wilson Center, and he's expected to meet with Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday at the State Department. But today's meeting with President Joe Biden, one of the main topics to be discussed was the plan agreed by NATO members last week to provide new training and cooperation assistance to Ukraine. Let's listen to what Julianne Smith, the U.S. ambassador to NATO, had to say about this new agreement that was finalized last week, and she spoke about this morning.
It is now time to step back and figure out how NATO can provide better coordination of those efforts, not just the security assistance that's flowing into Ukraine, but also the training. Many countries are training Ukrainian troops. We want to make sure that those efforts are properly coordinated and brought together under one roof.
So, Steve, there's more than 50 nations providing security assistance to Ukraine. So NATO's new plan is to have at least 700 NATO service members posted in a military base in Germany that then will provide coordination and logistic support to all of this donations coming from these 50 allied nations. Let's listen to what Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said last week at the Minister of Defense meeting of NATO in Brussels last Friday. Let's listen.
Support Ukraine through the planning and coordination of donations, manage transfer and repair of equipment, provide support to the long-term development of Ukraine's armed forces. These efforts do not make NATO a party to the conflict.
So these are some of the additional tasks NATO will pick up in support of Ukraine. It's also important, Steve, to mention that Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg touted this morning at the Wilson Center, and of course with President Joe Biden, that in 2024, 20 of the 32 NATO members will reach their 2% military spending, 2% of their GDP, as they committed back in 2014. And this is a significant increase, but because before the Ukraine war in 2021, only 6 countries were paying up their dues to NATO, Steve.
So, Louise, this meeting is taking place shortly after the series of multilateral summits in Europe and ahead of NATO's anniversary. Can you give us a little bit more background about the context of today's meeting between Biden and the NATO chief?
No, of course. You mentioned earlier the last week was the G7 summit in Italy, but also the Defense Ministers Summit, the NATO Defense Ministers Summit in Brussels, and also last weekend, the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland. Now, during that Peace Summit in Switzerland, over 100 countries participated, and 80 of them actually signed a letter where they reinforced their support for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. President Joe Biden was not present at the Peace Summit in Switzerland. Instead was Vice President Kamala Harris. Let's listen to what Kamala Harris and also Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said during this Peace Summit in Switzerland.
President Joe Biden and I will continue to support Ukraine and continue to impose costs on Russia. And we will continue to work toward a just and lasting peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter and the will of the people of Ukraine.
The peace formula is inclusive, and we are happy to hear and work on all proposals, all ideas, what is really needed for peace and what is important to you, dear friends. I urge all of you to be as active as possible.
So, Steve, as I just mentioned, we saw the G7 meeting in Italy last week. We saw also the defense minister meetings of NATO members in Brussels last Friday, the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland. But also now we have to add the context that the Russian government announced this Monday that Vladimir Putin will be traveling to North Korea on Tuesday for a two-day meeting with Kim Jong-un, the leader of the North Korean regime. So you can see both sides of the international struggle or debate shoring up their allies. Steve.
A lot of stuff, a lot of moving pieces. I think it's important to note that Ukraine's desire to join NATO was potentially, arguably, the impetus for this whole war. And now you see Putin going over to North Korea. Certainly unnerving, to say the least. NTD's Washington correspondent Luis Martinez from the White House. Thank you, Luis. So what are the key outcomes of the G7 summit in Italy last week? And how binding are those agreements that the leaders made? Joining me now is Dale Copeland, professor of international relations at the University of Virginia, to assess the road ahead. Professor Dale Copeland, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much, Steve.
It's great to have you, Professor. We saw the reports coming out of Italy of the G7 agreements to use frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine. Calls for a ceasefire in Gaza and also to support partners in the Indo-Pacific and Africa. These agreements aren't technically binding. With the political shakeup in the EU and the U.S. presidential election in November, what are the implications for these agreements?
Well, Steve, I do think there's two big takeaways if you look at their communique and some of the things the White House has put out. It's one, the focus on Russia and the Ukraine war and making sure that the Russians understand that the EU and the G7 partners are united to fight Ukraine to the last end, not to the last end, but to as long as it takes was the phrase. And the second big takeaway, aside from a lot of other things, is the new focus on China's support for Russia and it's the G7's upset. Let's just call it the worries or concerns, as they call it, about China's support for not just Russia, but for the dumping practices that are hurting markets around the world. So those are two big things. But the larger implications, I think, of what you just mentioned are very straightforwardly that the U.S. and the G7 partners will use Russian frozen assets, mostly banking assets in the European banking system, to fund the war against Russia, which is a new aspect in world history, you might say, of taking the other's assets and using it to fund a war against that very state. And I think that's actually a very smart move. They shied away from it in the first year or two. But I think this shift shows to Russia that the costs of what they're doing are going to be incredibly high as they go forward. And that's the main point here. We're trying to get a bargained ceasefire or some kind of long-term resolution in Ukraine. And by showing the Russians, which after all are the bigger party relative to Ukraine, to show the Russians that their costs will keep going up and up and up and they won't be able to gain from their war, is the way to bring the Russians, Moscow, to the bargaining table. And that's the main objective. The second aspect of that is simply by getting China to put pressure on Russia, and that is called for in the communique, and to reduce, or to at least convince the Chinese to reduce their support for the Russian industrial production of munitions. That will also increase Russia's sense that they have to end this war soon.
You have President Biden meeting with NATO Secretary Stoltenberg today. Putin also scheduled to meet with Kim Jong-un. Does this speak to a greater schism in what can be done to decelerate tensions with Russia, pushing them further into the arms of totalitarian regimes like North Korea, like China?
Well, that relationship with the North Koreans goes back to 1949-50, of course, and it's been pretty strong ever since then, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but especially under Putin, who, of course, was a part of the KGB during the time of the Soviet Union. So I'm not surprised by that. I don't think it represents anything significantly different. The North Koreans, after all, have been supplying Russia directly with munitions. China only supplies you might say, the infrastructure and some of the parts that allow the Russians to make their own munitions. But it's a sign, in fact, of Russian weakness, and has been for more than a year, that they have to get direct munitions for the war from North Korea, and drones, of course, from Iran. China has not supplied those direct munitions, so that's an important distinction there. Yes, there is this quasi-alliance structure, you might call it an authoritarian bloc, that sweeps from Belarus, Russia, across to North Korea, China. And there's no getting around that. But the question really is, how can we as the US work on the fissures and tensions within that relationship to reduce its coherence? And we did this, of course, effectively in 1969 to 72, when Kissinger played the so-called China card against the Soviet Union to bring Russia to the bargaining table. And it worked very effectively. We got the détente of 72, partly because Russia feared China. Now, how do we get back to a situation where China fears Russia, well, and therefore doesn't want to have as much involvement with Russia? That's a tricky one, but let's not forget they have this long 800-mile border, common border, that they still contest, or at least China contests it and says it wants some of its territory back that was stolen way back in the 1860s. And, they almost fought a war in 1969-70. So that border is not going away and makes for tension, a natural geopolitical tension. Not that we can exploit that in the short term, but in the long term, I personally believe that China will see the value of its global economic position as being more important than its relationship with Russia per se.
Professor Dale Copeland, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.